What's up, wrestling fans? Richard Boudreau here. Welcome to a brand new edition of Kayfabe Kickout Audio for December 21st, 2013 for KayfabeKickout.com, putting the pro back in pro wrestling. Today, my very special guest is a man who needs no introduction, but I will give him one anyway. He is the man, not a myth, but certainly a legend in professional wrestling. Former WCW, NWA, WWE, TNA, ROH, executive, one of the greatest professional...
Only about OVW.
OVW, yes, absolutely, OVW, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, Memphis Wrestling, one of the greatest professional wrestling managers of all time, and a brilliant wrestling mind, Jim Cornette. Jim, how are you?
Richard, I'm great. Thank you for having me on the program.
You're very welcome. First off, I just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas, and I say Merry Christmas because I know you're an old school guy from Louisville, Kentucky that says Merry Christmas and not this Happy Holidays bullshit.
Well, I like Merry Christmas. I like Happy Holidays. I'm a big New Year's fan. I like any excuse to eat good food and give people presents and get some in return. I'm all about that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite times of the year as well. So let's start the show off. You have a brand new book called Rags, Paper, and Pins, The Merchandising of Memphis Wrestling. Can you just tell the listeners what this book is all about?
Well, actually, Mark James, my co-author who does the MemphisWrestlingHistory.com website, came up to see me, I guess it was last February, and spent a couple of days here at Castle Cornette and saw the memorabilia collection that I have, and he's done some great books on wrestling history, Memphis in particular, and we decided to do a little something different because a lot of books have been published with, just results of matches and different things and clippings, but we went back because Memphis, as a wrestling territory, was on the cutting edge of merchandising. Back before you could get Titantrons and action figures and underwear with wrestlers' faces on it, most of the wrestling merchandise was sold in the arenas. And the Memphis territory was ahead of its time on that, with selling not only programs and magazines and pictures, but also records, Memphis being the birth of the blues and the home of rock and soul and all those musical genres, records and different pieces of merchandise. And so we went back and reproduced so many of those all the way back to the 50s, the programs. And, of course, that's the way that I got started in wrestling, was taking pictures at ringside for the magazines and programs in the Memphis territory. So I have a huge collection of photos, and we put together a 350-page book that not only kind of takes you chronologically from the early 50s up to the glory period of the 80s, but also is kind of my autobiography of my teenage years and how I got started in wrestling, and how that the guys in Memphis with 8 or 10,000 people a week in the Memphis Mid-South Coliseum alone and wrestling 6 and 7 nights a week, these guys with $1 and $3 pictures at the merchandise tables were making more money at merchandise than they were wrestling in some cases. So
wow.
We've told that story. We've recapped the big gates and crowds and rivalries and feuds and top stars, and even picked the top 5 of Memphis records. I'm not Casey Kasem, but I did a pretty good job at it, and that is available, by the way, as are all of my fine products and merchandise at JimCornette.com. And it's also available on Amazon for the folks who don't want an autographed copy, because I don't live in the Amazon offices. But if you go to JimCornette.com, you can get autographed copies. You can go to Amazon and get that book. And, of course, only available at JimCornette.com is also my Midnight Express and Jim Cornette 25th Anniversary Scrapbook, which won the Wrestling Observer Book of the Year Award a few years ago. So lots of great stuff there. It may be too late to shop for Christmas, but it's never too late to get fine wrestling products for the wrestling fan in the family, the Cornette fan in the family, or just the fan of quality merchandise. Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know any wrestling fan who in the right mind wouldn't want an autographed copy. So I look forward to getting this book myself, because I'm a big fan of wrestling books in general. And so whose idea, when you worked for Memphis Wrestling, whose idea was it to start start dishing out merchandise? Whose idea was that?
Well, they had sold programs at the matches back, since there were paper and matches. But then the old days, back in the 60s and 70s, the guys found that there was a market for the old black and white 8x10 publicity photos, and those were sold at the matches for quite a while, along with some autograph albums and things of that nature. And then when I came along, being a fresh-faced young teenager here in Louisville, and started taking color pictures, Christine Jarrett, who was Jerry Jarrett's mother, Jeff Jarrett's grandmother, and she was the promoter for the matches here in Louisville and around the area, she saw those pictures and said, I think those would really sell because they look so much nicer than the black and white ones. And so by the time I was 15 years old, I kind of had my own little side business, because they eventually replaced the old 8x10 black and white photos that were of somewhat lesser quality. And as they say, the rest is history. It snowballed from there.
Wow. That's amazing because, when I think back to, wrestling in the 50s and 60s, most, including myself, like most wrestling fans probably never would have clued in that there was even, merchandising back then.
Well, some territories didn't do it. I mean, there were a lot of arena programs in most places, but some of the wrestling territories didn't go any further with the merchandise. And the Tennessee territory, being as they did great business and had huge crowds in Louisville and Nashville and Memphis and places like that, but they didn't necessarily have the big population centers of New York or Chicago, etc. So as an extra added incentive, Jerry Jarrett is the one who really took off with it and who realized that if he allowed the guys to have their picture money, then he could afford much better talent than if they were just working on payoffs alone. And as a result, it worked out well for everybody. Yeah,
it definitely sounds like it did. I mean, can you imagine if we go back to the 50s, if, say, Gorgeous George, had, merchandising like T-shirts and action figures, he probably would have made even more money than when he did, when he was a top star.
Well, we figured out, because I was involved with that from 1976 until I got in the business as a manager in 1982, and in that 6-7 year period, we were able to basically go back through my old records and figure out that some guys like Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee, and Jimmy Valiant sold anywhere between 150 and 300,000 photos
wow.
over those years at $1 and $3 a piece.
Wow, Jesus!
And it did. My mother started driving me to the matches because when I started taking pictures, I was too young for a driver's license. And by the time that I got one, she had become one of the merchandise salespeople. And we also figured out, just to make the independent wrestlers of today a little jealous, the two ladies who sold pictures and merchandise at the Louisville Gardens every Tuesday night, 52 weeks a year, just on their 10% apiece commission for selling the pictures, probably made about $4,000 or $5,000 a year in cash apiece,
wow.
just selling merchandise one night for 3 hours on Tuesday. That's before Vince McMahon made wrestling a big business, you understand?
Yes, for sure. And I mean, with numbers like that, it sounded like, even, women that are ladies of the evening didn't do as well as people did in Memphis.
Well, I'll tell you what, there were quite a few female fans back then, too, when you buying those pictures, when you had guys like Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee and the Fabulous Ones and the Rock and Roll Express and all those heartthrobs. The crowds, in some cases, were 60% female back in those days. And, of course, when you had a town like Memphis, which just did insane numbers for so many years, it's a recorded fact that in 1974, 51 wrestling shows at the Mid-South Coliseum drew a total of 350,000 paid admissions.
Wow.
And, find me, 40 years later, find me a city anywhere in the world that sells 350,000 wrestling tickets a year, and I'll eat your hat even if you're not wearing one.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. I honestly can't think of any city in the world that would draw big numbers like that. In 2013, as you know, the scope of the landscape of pro wrestling has changed significantly.
Well, and we're also, as a matter of fact, Mark and I have a series of books planned. We're going to be covering Smoky Mountain Wrestling in 2014, and also we're doing research for a book on Louisville wrestling history. There's an author here locally that's a friend of mine named John Cosper, who's had several non-wrestling books published, but he's doing research at the Louisville Free Public Library on the history of Louisville wrestling going back to the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Finding out some things I didn't even know, some great matches involving Jim Londos and Everett Marshall, and Lou Thez as a rookie wrestled here because St. Louis is right down the road. But Mark and I are going to be doing a book concentrating on the Memphis territory, the Jerry Jarrett years, specifically from 1970 to 1985, much like he has done in Memphis. And I invite everybody to go to memphiswrestling.com and check out his fine publications. But the Louisville Gardens, the original arena here in town, is known for hosting more Major League professional wrestling events in the 20th century than any other arena in the country.
Wow.
And there were weekly events from 1970 until the late 90s. So that right there, from the Memphis territory, then later on Ohio Valley Wrestling took over the tradition. That right there is an accomplishment. But the Gardens, back when it was known as the Armory, and later on the Convention Center, was hosting regular weekly matches back in the 30s and 40s, and saw some tremendous crowds and some great talent, including, NWA World Champions like Lou Thez and Wild Bill Longs and Everett Marshall, and et cetera. So it's really a city with great wrestling history, and we're going to be doing a series of publications that focuses on the various eras of that venerable building.
That's tremendous, and I think it's great that you and other people in the industry are putting out books like this, because for a lot of younger fans, like fans that are younger than myself, that are Generation Y fans that just know the product of WWE and to a lesser extent TNA, I think it'll be fans that want to know more about the long, rich history of professional wrestling can turn to books like yours.
Well, and we've got to keep these stories alive, and I have one of the world's largest pro wrestling memorabilia collections. Everybody knows. As a matter of fact, if you go to my website also, and I'm not just trying to sell you things, but we've just completely redesigned and revamped it in November, and there's a section called From the Vault where you can go and see some of my most prized possessions. There's pictures and anecdotes about those, and also a collection of my columns on wrestling history that I write for Fighting Spirit magazine, which is the United Kingdom's largest pro wrestling, MMA, and combat sports publication, on the newsstands, available all over the United Kingdom. But also you can go to, I believe it's Fighting Spirit. Just look up Fighting Spirit magazine on the web, because they're one of those UK websites. And of course I have, and I'm not trying to run you out of business, but while I'm doing all my plugs, Richard, I've got my podcast, The Jim Cornette Experience, weekly on MLW Radio, and you can go to MLW.com for more information about that, or just go to JimCornette.com and click on my podcast link, and that'll take you right to it. And as well, I've recently been lighting up Twitter at the Jim Cornette. You can follow me. Somebody got Jim Cornette, and we called Twitter to complain about it, and they said, well, if you can prove that you're really Jim Cornette, then we'll. I said, well, but the guy that took my name didn't have to prove he was Jim Cornette, so why do I have to prove that I... So it's at the Jim Cornette. You can follow me on Twitter and become a member of the Cult of Cornette. And you can also find out more information about my tour of the United Kingdom in February. I'm going to be going to Glasgow, Scotland, Manchester, Birmingham, London's Leicester Square Theatre, Cardiff, Wales. This retirement thing is turning out to be quite hectic. I'm like Jim Ross. I'm busier now than I was when I was actually active in the wrestling business.
So you heard it here first, wrestling fans. Like Jim said, you can check out his website. And staying on the topic of your website, I frequent it quite often. And when I saw, switching gears, when I saw your massive comic book collection, I swear to God, I screamed like a little 12-year-old girl upon seeing the Beatles the first time at Shea Stadium. Because I know that's probably a little outdated reference for some of the younger listeners, but
but I got it.
Yeah, you got it, and I got it. So I'm an avid comic book collector myself, but when I saw your collection, it was just absolutely amazing. What are some of the some of the prize comics you have?
Well, I started collecting comic books through my older cousins when I was just 5 or 6 years old, and back in the late '60s, early '70s, they were 12 cents on the stands, and you could get back issues for $2 or $3 at most.
Wow!
If you were just looking for Marvels and DCs, we're not talking about the Golden Age stuff. But I basically, by the time I got busy with wrestling in my late teens and had to give up something, I'd assembled a complete collection of every Marvel and DC superhero book from 1962 to 1975.
Oh, my God.
And I still have the majority of those. Over the past year, since I've been off the road with wrestling, if you go to the website, you'll see the picture of the vault that you were talking about. I've got too much stuff in my house. I've been a lifelong collector. Not only did I collect comic books and wrestling memorabilia, but toys and horror movie memorabilia and hardback and paperback books and pop culture. I've got a giant vinyl record collection.
Wow.
And so, something has to go because I live in a pretty big house, but I'm running out of room. So over the past year, I've sold a few comic books off, but my prize book still remains my Amazing Fantasy 15.
Wow. Oh, my God.
That I bought in 1973 for $25 from the original owner. It's worth considerably more now for you non-comic fans out there. It's the first appearance of Spider-Man.
Yes.
And, I've been selling some of the other comic books, but, that may be, if I keep one, it's going to be that one, but I'm thinking about doing a promotion in 2014 involving my Amazing Fantasy 15 and giving the fans a chance, not only because if I'm going to sell it, I want to find it a good home.
Yes.
So I'm going to give the fans not only a chance to purchase my Amazing Fantasy 15 that's been in my collection for 40 years, but also actually meet me in person to come pick it up. So more on that later. You can keep watching the website. But, I'm a big Avengers fan. I'm sitting on top of a complete run of the Avengers 1 through 100. I really had everything up until I've sold a few, as I said, over the past year, but some nice stuff there. But when you got 10,000 comic books in 52 white long boxes that are sitting in front of your 4,000 wrestling videotapes, it's just hard to get to everything. You know what I'm saying, Richard?
Absolutely. No, as I said, I'm a avid comic book collector, but I also collect memorabilia myself, action figures from the 1970s and 80s. So I know what you're saying. I'm running in a room myself, and your wife must be she must be a very understanding woman.
Well, she's actually a collector also, and she has her own interests, including witches. She's got a large Wizard of Oz, Wicked Witch of the West collection, and
oh, nice.
And she also is really into horror movies like I am, and we have a lot of autographed memorabilia from different horror movies, both classic and modern. And, as a matter of fact, once again, if you go on the website, one of my favorite pieces of wrestling memorabilia, you may have seen this, is about 25 years ago or thereabouts, I obtained from the former NWA World Champion Pat O'Connor's widow. After he passed away, there were 3 sets of these in the world, the complete bound sets of all of the programs for Sam Muchnick's St. Louis Wrestling Promotions from his first card in 1945 until his retirement in 1982. They were bound in books.
Oh, my God.
And to just, as Emerald would say, to just jack it up a little bit, I took the first book to the Bad Blood pay-per-view in St. Louis that the WWF put on in 1997 with all the former NWA champions. And I had Sam Muchnick himself, plus Dory Funk Jr., Terry Funk, Jack Briscoe, Gene Kiniski, Harley Race. Who am I leaving out here? Oh, my God, several of the former champions that were there, and then also Ric Flair autograph it for me to make it one of a kind in the world. And that is my most prized wrestling possession, and you can go to the website, you can see pictures of those autographs and that bound set, along with a Wrestling Illustrated magazine from 1965 with the dream match between Bruno Sammartino and Lou Thez that never came about, but Bruno and Lou both personally autographed to me the cover of that, and that's another of my prized possessions. So I've got a lot of one-of-a-kind memorabilia here at Castle Cornette, but I'm turning some of it into landscaping because I've got a lot of property, and I got to plant some new trees.
Wow, that's tremendous. I mean, I wouldn't... as a wrestling fan, like I wouldn't even, and as a memorabilia fan, I wouldn't be able to put what you just described into any sort of dollar value, because I think something like that would be absolutely priceless.
I've had 3 5-figure bids that I turned down.
Oh my
because
God!
That's something I'm going to leave to my wife. Whenever I get hit by a bread truck and I'm 6 feet under, she's going to have a bed and breakfast somewhere on the coast on the ocean, and that's probably what's going to finance that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and like you said, the over 10,000 comics that you have in your collection, I mean, that could most likely fund your wife and the rest of your family the rest of their lives.
I guess I should mention, by the way, that the castle is also wired up with a state-of-the-art alarm system. So if anybody touches a window while I'm not home, the house goes off like a Roman candle.
There you go. Yeah, no, absolutely. I would imagine you'd have to have some sort of safeguards in effect to, a Castle Cornette to, secure all those valuables.
But like I said, I've enjoyed collecting things, but also I enjoy keeping these wrestling stories alive with the publications that we're doing. And Mark James is a tremendous guy to work with, and he's the internet and technical whiz, and I'm the research and memorabilia collecting half of the partnership, and it's turned out really well, and we're proud of the books and the publications that we're producing. And it's something to keep me off the streets at night. Also, I don't want to get in trouble.
Well, all these books that you commented that you're planning on releasing on are just tremendous, and I look forward to to buying and reading all of them. So let's talk about your career in pro wrestling. Your gimmick when you started out as a professional wrestling manager. As the inept manager who kept getting fired by all of his clients. Who came up with that? That gimmick?
Well, Jerry Jarrett. Obviously, I owe almost everything to. The only person I owe really more to than Jerry Jarrett, Bill Watts for making me a main event player in wrestling. Dusty Rhodes for making the Midnight Express so valuable and such a main event attraction. But Christine Jarrett, Jerry's mother, actually is who got me my start. And as I said, my mother used to drive me to the matches before I was old enough to have a driver's license. And after 6 or 7 years of me hanging around doing the ring announcing, taking the pictures, helping sell merchandise, and being a general all-around gopher, Jerry approached me right before my 21st birthday, and he said, "Would you like to be a manager?" And I sounded like Ralph Cramden. I didn't know what to say. But Jerry had the idea that a takeoff on the old Playboy Gary Hart gimmick that he had in the early 60s when he got into professional wrestling was that he came from a rich, wealthy family in Chicago and that his mother had bought his way in. And of course, the Playboy part didn't fit me, but it was believable to the wrestling fans, since they'd seen me with my mom. And he came up with the idea that obviously I wouldn't be a heel right off the bat, that I was just this clueless rich putz that wanted to buy my way into something that was reserved for real men who had to fight their way. And as a result, I would get natural heat from that. And I started asking the heroes like Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee and Dutch Mantell if I could manage them. And one by one, they would turn me down, and then I would pitch a fit, and then they would get a little stiffer with their comments about me, and that gave me a grudge against them to want to then sign up the heels who would get even with these people who had embarrassed, me with, the name of Cornette and my standing in society. And it was a very natural way to enter and explain why that suddenly this ringside photographer who was nice to everybody would suddenly be such an arrogant prick. And Jerry always wanted everything explained very logically and credibly and wanted to tell the truth as much as possible so that when you did exaggerate, people couldn't really tell where the line of fact and fiction was blurred. And that was what he came up with. And thanks to not only working with great talent like Lawler and Dundee and Dutch, but also a great announcer like Lance Russell, who was able to get these things over on television, really, before I knew exactly what the fuck I was doing. You know, they made me look like I knew what I was doing. It was like dancing with Fred Astaire. You can't look too bad. Mm-hmm. There you have it.
Wow. You had mentioned earlier that you were kind of taken back when Jerry approached you. Like, what did you think of this gimmick? Like, were you apprehensive about doing it, or were you just ready to jump on in?
Oh, are you kidding? I was so enamored of wrestling and had been for so long and remained that way, and I'm still probably the world's biggest pro wrestling fan. It's just sports entertainment that gives me gas. But, you know, as soon as he said that, he said, you know, go home and ask your mother, first of all, if we can malign her on television. And, of course, she knew how much I wanted to do it, and she said yes without hesitation. And he said, you know, show up next week on TV with a suit if you want to do this. And the next week I was at TV taping with actually I had to buy a suit. I didn't own a suit at the time. Teenagers weren't big suit wearers back in the 70s. But no, pretty much instantly. I think if he'd have said, I want you to wear a chicken suit, wave your arms over your head, and cluck, I would have done that.
Oh, man. Yeah, I remember, you know, I've been a wrestling fan since the mid-'80s, 1985, and, you know, your gimmick, you know, as the rich, spoiled asshole that carried that god-awful tennis racket to the ring and would use that as a weapon is just like one of the fondest memories I have that stick in my mind when it comes to professional wrestling managers.
Well, I appreciate that, and that was, you know, that was something that set me apart also, because managers had always carried canes or umbrellas or, you know, some form of blunt instrument, but never a tennis racket. And actually I got that because I watched one of the teen movies that was popular in the early 80s, and the rich kid in the crowd was always carrying a badminton racket at this particular movie. I can't even remember what the title was, but I said, that might be an idea. And it came in handy not only to use in the matches, but also because it gave me a couple of feet worth of reach on all the fans that wanted to beat me up, because everybody knew they could beat me up. I mean, I've had women attack me at the matches before. Everybody knew that. No, I'm not even kidding you. I've been punched, slapped, and tackled by a number of females out of the crowd, and so at least it gave me a little reach on the. I never hit a woman with the racket, but I've hit quite a number of men.
I can only imagine, and that was, you know, back in the days in the 70s and 80s when kayfabe was still, you know, when it wasn't on life support, and fans, you know, fans actually, you know, took their pro wrestling a hell of a lot more seriously.
Well, as a matter of fact, doing research for this upcoming book on Louisville history, I'm going back through all my notebooks that I kept as a teenager when I was the ringside photographer and going to the matches as a fan and reporting for the magazines. And during one 3-month period alone, I made note that there were 7 incidents where fans hit the ring, including one guy with a knife.
Oh my God!
And tried to attack the wrestlers they were mad at. And it even got to the point where there was one night when Jimmy Hart first got involved in wrestling as a manager. He was managing Jerry Lawler in Louisville, and there was a match with Lawler and Ken Lucas. And after the match, it ended in controversy, and Jimmy Hart jumped in and was wailing away on Ken Lucas after Lawler had put him down, and Lawler was holding the referee back so that Jimmy Hart could have his way with Ken Lucas, and a guy from the crowd leaped into the ring and just started wailing on Jimmy Hart.
Oh, my God.
And instantly, about six cops went in the ring and grabbed this guy and just threw him. I have this on videotape, as a matter of fact. Threw him a cartwheel over the top rope out to the floor. And just then, from the other side of the ring, Jerry Jarrett, who was recognized as the promoter at the time, ran in the ring in street clothes because that was his time to come in and try to stop the melee. And one of the cops turned around and saw this guy in street clothes sliding in the other side of the ring and grabbed his gun and almost drew it out of the holster, and then saw that it was Jerry Jarrett and dropped it at that point. But Jerry Jarrett almost got shot in his own town.
Oh my God!
For coming into the ring on a finish that he called himself.
Wow, that's like unbelievable. If you know, most wrestling fans today wouldn't even believe that such things happened in the 70s and 80s. And you look at countries like Puerto Rico, where kayfabe is still alive down there, and fans still take wrestling pretty seriously down there.
Well, and that's something that I think. Obviously, it's easier on the heels these days that they don't have fans attacking them with knives and blunt instruments and their fists on a regular basis. But at the same time, that type of emotion and passion and belief and that's what kept people coming back week after week to see their heroes finally triumph over the evil villains. And that's why a city the size of Louisville, which back in the 70s the metropolitan area population of Louisville maybe was 500,000 people, and we were drawing 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people every Tuesday night to the Louisville Gardens. Now, if you did that in New York today, the same percentage, you'd be drawing what, about 500,000 people for every match?
Wow, that's an extremely impressive stat for Louisville, because when most wrestling fans think of what is the number one venue that most fans recognize in terms of drawing big box office gates, and most fans would say obviously Madison Square Garden, but to hear a stat about Louisville, that's just amazing.
Well, and even back in the 70s and 80s, Madison Square Garden was the mecca of wrestling as far as the most people every month. They ran once a month and would sell out at 20 or 21,000, 22,000 people. Sometimes they'd close circuit to the Felt Forum, which is now, I believe, the Paramount Theater. But when you consider that was 12 times a year, that was still only about 300,000 people. So Memphis was beating that number because of the weekly events, and a lot of other cities, especially down south, were beating that number as well because they had weekly events down south in these major arenas. And I recall in 1986, this is documented in my Midnight Express scrapbook, available at jimcornette.com. 4 shows in Charlotte, North Carolina at the Charlotte Coliseum over a period of about 12 weeks drew 3 sellouts of 12,000 and 1 crowd of 8,000. So you're talking about 44,000 people that went to 4 shows in a period of about 12 weeks.
Jeez.
And that was Midnight Express and Rock and Roll Express, by the way. We're on all 4 of those shows. Thank you very much. And it just shows the tremendous business at the time that the NWA was doing. They just weren't in the big media centers and the big areas like New York and Los Angeles where they got all the attention. But I would venture to say that Greensboro, North Carolina, and Charlotte, North Carolina, in 1986 drew more fans to see pro wrestling than any other cities in the country.
Well, and that was and that's back in the good old days of the territory days. And I think now in 2013, I think in my opinion that you rarely draw big numbers like that, even for a global conglomerate like the WWE.
Well, it's become a situation now that that everything is exposed and somewhat pasteurized and homogenized and sanitized, and it's become a situation where, once a year, wrestling comes to town. It's like the Harlem Globetrotters or Holiday on Ice. Let's go see the show. But back then, not only did the fans take wrestling seriously, but the wrestlers took wrestling very seriously. And we wouldn't be doing this interview right now because I wouldn't be telling you, oh, yes, this was entertainment. That was not only an offense worthy of being fired if you were a wrestler, but also the guys in the locker room would beat you up before the promoter got a chance to fire you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like back in the days of kayfabe, the heels would drive in one car and the baby faces would drive in another. They'd have separate dressing rooms, and you don't see any of that anymore.
Well, there's no pretense, and that's why I've always said over the past couple of years, the most successful pro wrestling promotion in the world is now the UFC. Because their fights are legitimate. Don't get me wrong. Not trying to say anything against their sport, but the way that they hype fights and the way that they build confrontations and the way that they manage to make their stars looked at as the toughest guys in their weight class on the planet, and they're going to have this title match, and who's going to win? That's exactly what pro wrestling did for the first 80 or so years of its existence until the TV networks and the people from outside wrestling and the creative writers got involved and decided to reinvent the wheel and put 4 corners on that wheel, and now there are fewer people going to see wrestling live. There's fewer people watching wrestling on television, and there's fewer people making a living full-time in the wrestling business than at any point since the late 1800s. And it's a shame.
It really
but
is.
You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
No, unfortunately not. And it's interesting that you mentioned the UFC, because I don't know if you're a boxing fan, but the Mayweather-Alvarez fight, that was promoted in such a excellent way. I actually thought for a minute I was watching pro wrestling because of the build-up. They have promos like, I know Alvarez he's not a master of English, but even his promos were fantastic. And of course, Mayweather is like one of the most magnetic, charismatic athletes on the face of the planet. And it's sad that pro wrestling has distanced itself from, those aspects of, building matches and, having, months upon months long feuds, and it's really a shame that it's just another form of entertainment.
Well, yeah, I've never been a huge boxing fan, although obviously since I'm from Louisville, Muhammad Ali is of interest to everybody in town, and for the Ali Frazier fights and Ali Foreman and those classic fights in the 60s, 70s, and even almost into the 80s that Ali had, that was transcendent of boxing into a cultural phenomenon. And Ali, growing up here in Louisville, was a wrestling fan, watched wrestling on TV, and I mean, this is an accepted fact that's been documented and talked about. Ali took his shtick, his promos, from the bad guy wrestlers that he saw on television as a child, and he was able to transfer that into his sport and make himself larger than life. And I mean, there's people who still believe that boxing is completely legitimate, even though those in the know, know. I mean, it never got to the extent of wrestling, and it never got manipulated to the extent of wrestling. But at the same time, anybody who thinks every boxing match has been completely legitimate, I got some oceanfront property in Kentucky I would love to sell you. And, they just took care of their business better than we did. Sometimes even both guys in the fight didn't know that it was a work. Sometimes the guy that was going over thought he was really knocking the guy out, and the other guy was saying, okay, I've got the check, I'm going to take the bump at the right time.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not only, I think nowadays it's not only boxing that's kind of lopsided when it comes to, being a work to a certain extent, but I find even other sports like hockey and even NFL football, I think to a certain extent there's a little bit of rigging going on.
Well, anytime you sell tickets to something, it becomes entertainment, and it naturally then becomes subject to being manipulated. But of course, the Chicago White Sox, the Black Sox scandal, we
Yes.
could go on. It's harder to manipulate team sports, and that's what wrestling started by, being manipulated. Not worked, not choreographed, just manipulated. Matches being made that the outcome could probably be figured by the folks in the know and the matchmakers. And then some of the wrestlers started getting together amongst themselves without even telling the promoters. And this is back in the 20s, and saying, hey, we could make a little more money if we just did a little business. And things evolved from there. And, Dana White, that's why I'm so proud of him, because he wants to distance himself from pro wrestling, and I don't blame him, because he wants everybody to realize that his fights are legitimate, but at the same time, the way that they hype fights, and certainly the guys like Chael Sonnen, who grew up as wrestling fans and who were able to hype a fight, regardless of whether the fight is legitimate, that's like number 5 or 6 on the reason of why people buy it. They want to see the personalities, they want to see the conflict and the confrontation, and that's why it's become big money, because not only do they get a chance to see the trash talking that used to be associated with pro wrestling, but then they get to see a real fight on top of it. So you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though that pro wrestling is a work, but injuries still occur. Now, you and I have something in common, because for you it was Starrcade '86. You fell 20 feet off of scaffolding. I myself fell off scaffolding close to 20 feet, and when I was in the military, and I shattered my wrist. So, looking back at that match, would you have done anything differently, or you know, for fans who may
I would have not blown my knee out if I could help it, but
yeah, for some wrestling fans that, you know, may not know what I'm talking about, just give us a little recap of that fateful day.
Well, the scaffold match at Starrcade '86, actually, it's what I'm most known for, because up until Mick Foley, Mankind was thrown off the top of the Hell in a Cell at King of the Ring in '98 by The Undertaker, my scaffold match bump was the most replayed bump in the history of wrestling. And
I can believe it.
Jim Cornette, of all people. But it was the Midnight Express versus the Road Warriors, the Night of the Skywalkers, Starrcade '86, the first $1 million gate that the NWA had ever drawn. And at the end of it, to try to take people's mind off the fact that the Midnight Express had lost, Dusty Rhodes' idea, which I went along with, maybe not wholeheartedly, but you didn't say no in those days, was for me to be chased up the scaffold and hang and drop from it. Oof. And, you know, scaffold matches had been invented in the Memphis territory, so I'd seen a number of them, but unfortunately this night they had a budget. And since they had a budget, they made the biggest, highest scaffold we had ever seen. It was 24 feet off the floor, 21 feet off the ring.
Oh, my God.
And when I hung, I got 2-foot-long arms, and I'm 6 feet tall. That means I was still about 16 feet up in the air.
Jesus.
And when I landed, blew the anterior cruciate ligament in my right knee, tore up a lot of the cartilage. It was very painful. It still hurts me in cold weather. But I got a great payoff for that night. Of course, then I had surgery and missed a few weeks of work, so I lost most of it. But at least my most famous injury was witnessed by more people than anything else that I ever did, and that, you know, at least is some small compensation.
Wow. Well, I mean, you know, like you said, you got a fantastic payout from it, and unfortunately, you had to have surgery. And like when I watched that match, now Big Bubba was involved in that match. Now he looked like he kind of missed the mark there when he was supposed to land on him.
He lost me in the light. What happened was Dusty's original vision for this thing was that I would hang from underneath the scaffold, because there was like a ladder monkey bar apparatus underneath the scaffold, and I would hang from it, and the Midnight Express and Big Bubba, who was 6'6" and 350 pounds, would be underneath the scaffold, and Dusty said, well, just kick your feet up, baby. Just kick your feet up. and catch you like they catch the cheerleaders at the football games. And so we went out there in the Omni that night in Atlanta and looked at that thing before the show, and I said, the University of Alabama football team could not catch me coming off that. I'll kill everybody. So Plan B, a hastily thought out Plan B, was that, well, I'll just drop and I'll throw my arms out to the side, and Bubba is so much bigger than I am. If Bubba, if you can just get your arms under my arms, then break a little of my fall, and we will drop and roll to the left like the parachute jumpers. And so you see Bubba, if you watch the tape, you see Bubba under me, and he's like, and suddenly when I let go, I defied gravity. Instead of falling at a normal rate, it looked like I'd been shot out of a gun straight down, and I just went straight through his arms and landed, blew my knee. I'm laying there, I'm screaming, and Bubba's looking down at me. He's like, Jimmy, you fell so fast.
Oh, my God. Jesus. Like, obviously, like, you don't hold any, you know, to this day, you don't hold any animosity towards, you know, Bubba for missing the target, or...
No, I mean, when I went back and watched the tape, my God, he'd have been an idiot if he was under me. I probably would have killed him even the way I was coming down.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he tried as best he could, but as he said, Jimmy, you fell so fast.
Oh, my God.
But he did do one good thing for me, because as he was standing there, when I landed and crumpled and flew backward, the back of my head flew back into his kneecap, and it knocked me out about 20 seconds or so and served as a natural anesthetic so that I didn't feel the immediate pain until I came to.
Oh, my God. Wow. So,
but you know, hey, that's the thing, and so many people, and especially now that, once again, that wrestling has been exposed for being entertainment, so many people go, well, they don't get hurt, they know how to fall. Mm-hmm. I've had chiropractors tell me when I was involved in training wrestlers that a flat back bump in a wrestling ring is the equivalent of a rear end collision in a car at 30 miles an hour. That's the snap, the punishment that you take. And
right.
When you think of of all the times these guys land, whether it be in the ring, even though it's padded, or on a floor, even though there's pads, it ain't ballet. And over the last 10, 15 years especially, we've had so many series of neck injuries and really career-ending injuries because the guys try to top themselves and they try to go one step further. And just a simple move can end in disaster. I was there at SummerSlam '97 in the Meadowlands Arena.
Yes.
In New Jersey, when Owen Hart, one of the most accomplished pro wrestlers in the world, gave Steve Austin a pile driver, and Steve Austin's head was, unfortunately, it made way too much contact with the mat, and he was paralyzed in the ring for about 30 seconds, and it led to his retirement 4 or 5 years later, the biggest box office attraction in the history of wrestling. It shortened his career from one simple move that's given and taken on a regular basis in wrestling, and so anything can happen. So to say yes, it is entertainment, and yes, it is predetermined, and yes, there is cooperation, that's fine and good. But to say that nobody gets hurt and that it isn't dangerous is not only ludicrous, but also insulting to the guys that go in there and put their necks literally on the line, every night for people's enjoyment. So, it ain't ballet. While it may be predetermined, it's still one of the most dangerous activities you're going to undergo.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody that, the typical non-wrestling fans will say that shit is fake and it's all predetermined and they know how to fall. It's like they watch, I say to them, watch the tape with you and the one with Mick Foley, and you get back to me and tell me that that shit is fake.
Well, it's like saying Evel Knievel's jumps were fake.
That's right.
He meant to do them and he worked them out ahead of time. He was still at risk of dying every time that he took off from that platform, and that's unfortunately the case. With pro wrestling, we have a saying: if you do it right, it hurts. If you do it wrong, you get hurt.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And when you mentioned Steve Austin, that I still cringe when I see the video today. Like almost 2 decades later, and his neck just looked like an accordion. And he could have been paralyzed for the rest of his life. And apparently, I don't know, you might know this better than I would, that apparently to this day that, well, now that Owen's not around, but he never apologized to Steve for that. I don't know if that's true, but
well, no, that's not true. I believe he certainly apologized, but I don't necessarily believe that Steve accepted it.
Okay.
And
understandable.
Then it was less than. I mean, now if everything was equal, I'm sure that there would have been a reconciliation because Steve's a great guy and he understands things happen. But it was just less than a year later that unfortunately Owen died in that tragic accident, and they never did get a chance to really reconcile over the thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and staying on the subject of Owen, you mentioned his passing, and that horrific night in May 1999. Where were you when all this went down?
Believe it or not, I was not there. That actually was the first WWF pay-per-view that I had missed in about 5 years because I was preparing to move from Connecticut back here to Louisville to start the developmental program with Ohio Valley Wrestling, and was not needed that night at the pay-per-view. So I was like everybody else. I was sitting at home watching it live as it happened.
Oh my God.
And obviously the incident was not aired on television because it was fortunately in a videotape replay segment that it happened. But when the camera came back in the arena and Jim Ross was trying to cover basically for why there was no action going on and that there was somewhat of a pall over the proceedings, and he didn't know what exactly was happening, so he was trying to choose his words carefully. I knew instantly that something was wrong, but we didn't know until sometime afterwards what exactly had happened, and that was, Owen, I just said, guys can get hurt, they're risking their lives, but that was completely unnecessary. And it was something that Owen was doing that he was not comfortable with, that he was asked to do, and still to this day I blame Vince Russo, like a lot of people do, because For those who don't know, Owen, instead of being able to do a normal entrance into the ring and have a wrestling match, which is dangerous enough, they decided that he would make a superhero entrance and be lowered into the ring in this outlandish costume that Russo had booked him to be in, and was being lowered by a rigging company that didn't check the rigging or whatever, and there were lawsuits, et cetera, but he fell 100 feet from the roof of the Kemper Arena in Kansas City into the ring and was killed. And, Owen was a great wrestler, and Owen didn't need all that, hoo-ha around him, but Vince Russo didn't feel that he was exciting enough as himself and wanted to make him a superhero and came up with the idea of doing that. And Owen wasn't comfortable with it, but he had already turned down a few things that he wasn't comfortable with, and he didn't want to be, negative Nancy and be known as the guy who kept saying no, so he went along with it, and it didn't turn out well. And that's one of the many things that I blame Vince Russo for spoiling the wrestling business, not only for the people in it, but for the people who like to watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a lot of wrestling fans, including myself, that agree with you when it comes to staying on the topic of Vince Russo. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this. You seem like a guy who's a little that's open to conspiracy theories, and I've heard this in passing. That do you think it's possible that Vince Russo was sent by Vince to WCW to try and bring it down purposely from within?
Actually, I would love to say that that's the case, but I can say without fear of contradiction that it wasn't, because what you had there was basically Vince Russo conning the folks that were running WCW into thinking that he was responsible for the WWF's success. And what you saw of Vince Russo's work in WCW was Vince Russo actually doing what he thought was best without having Vince McMahon to rein him in and filter him and cut out some of the horse shit. So while I would love to think it was a massive conspiracy theory and that nobody could be that inept while they were trying, the sad fact is that no, that was Vince Russo's best work that he was trying to give them, and they were stupid enough to fall for it.
Now, that just boggles my mind, because if obviously, I think in a lot of aspects, if it hadn't been for Russo going into WCW, they might still be around today. I mean, who knows?
Well, there was a lot more mismanagement involved in WCW than just Vince Russo's historically biblical proportion bad booking. Eric Bischoff was spending money like a drunken sailor because he hit on a formula that caught on, and he didn't know how to capitalize on it. The NWO invasion, an invasion angle always works. And he signed up a bunch of, they used to call him ATM Eric, because he signed a bunch of guys to contracts that were massively inflated, and if business ever went down, which after a 2-year hot period it did, that it would sink the company, but he wasn't smart enough to realize that. He gave out a lot of money. He would mismanage the company to where they didn't even know. Sometimes when they would go on the air for a 3-hour television program, they didn't know what was going to happen in hours 2 and 3 when hour 1 was starting.
Oh my God!
It was all done on the fly. There was mismanagement involved. Turner Broadcasting never knew what they had bought. They didn't know the people that were running it, whether they knew what they were doing or not. It was just a massive fiasco, and they owned the wrestling company from 1988 until 2001. They had 2 profitable years, I believe, which were 1997 and 1998. And in the last year of their ownership, they lost $60 million, which is an historic money loss for a wrestling promotion in history. And they didn't make a dime worth of profit from 1988 until 1996 because of the people they hired to manage the company. So, yeah, I would like to say it's all Vince Russo, because I hate Vince Russo so bad. But no, it was Eric Bischoff, and it was the Turner Broadcasting officials that didn't know what they bought, and there was a lot of people that had a hand in kicking that dead horse.
Yeah, no, that's for damn sure. And I don't know. I've heard this in passing. That apparently Hogan would get X amount of percentages of every pay-per-view, even ones that he wasn't even on. So I mean, if that's true, then it's no wonder that WCW.
Well, I don't know about that, that they gave him such a tremendous merchandise deal that every time they sold a Hulk Hogan T-shirt, they actually lost money. So
oh my God,
it would have been better if they'd have set the merchandise table up in the bathroom somewhere. They would have come out ahead than actually selling the stuff out front.
Oh my God.
But that, once again, that was an example of people buying. Every time that a corporate business gets into professional wrestling, and we've seen it with Turner Broadcasting, we've seen it with Panda Energy, we've seen it with Sinclair Broadcasting and Ring of Honor. Every time a corporate business gets involved in professional wrestling, even if they have people that mean well trying to advise them, they don't understand show business, they don't get show business, and eventually they fuck it up.
That's right.
And unfortunately now you can't have wrestling on any type of profitable level or any type of mainstream level without having corporate ownership or network TV ownership, because the game has been changed by Vince McMahon. And he's the only one that's been able to make it work and be profitable, because he wasn't bought by a corporation that was outside the wrestling business. He built his own and expanded his own, but it was always at the core owned by a wrestling promotion and run by a wrestling promotion. And that's the only way to be successful, because I've found that business people don't get show business. They might do the canned goods business good, but they don't do show business good.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, when you talk about WCW, when that AOL Time Warner merger, it seemed like from what a lot of people in the industry said, that they didn't even want to be associated with professional wrestling.
Well, no, and the idiots, at the time they were looking for somebody to buy the company. And I believe the guy's name was Jamie Kellner, but they put a guy in charge after the AOL Time Warner merger with Turner Broadcasting. They put a guy in charge of the networks that hated wrestling so bad that instead of keeping it on the air until they found someone to buy it, which they could probably have done so for $10 or $20 million, they canceled the television programs just to get it off the air. And as a result, without a television program on the air, the company was worth nothing, and Vince McMahon was able to buy it at fire sale prices just for the video library. So they cost themselves probably $15 million conservatively just by canceling the program before they found somebody to buy it.
Now, that's to me, that's mind-boggling, because I don't.
But hey, what's $15 million to AOL, Time Warner, Turner Broadcasting? It's like you and me saying, well, instead of going to Subway today, we'll go to Red Lobster and splurge. What's an extra $30?
Yeah, that's true. You do have a point there. With companies like that literally make billions and billions of dollars per year, $15 million is a pretty small amount. So
that's like when the Sinclair Broadcasting owns 140-something television stations. They're worth $1 billion, at least on paper. And we had the office manager calling us up to complain when one of the talents bought a Greyhound bus ticket to get to the TV taping when Hurricane Sandy came through and the public transportation was sidelined in the New York and New Jersey area. The guy called up and said, "Hey, was this expense approved ahead of time?" I said, "It's a fucking bus ticket."
Oh my God!
It's a fucking bus ticket, you idiot!
Wow,
But they're Republicans, so whatever.
So, staying on the topic of WCW, we've been talking about that for the past couple of minutes. Now, you were with WCW from its inception in 1988 till about 1990. You left shortly after Halloween Havoc. Now, for some wrestling fans may not know what that situation was. What was the deal behind that?
Well, you can read the entire long sordid saga in the Midnight Express scrapbook available at JimCornette.com. But in short, they hired a guy in January of 1989 to run the company named Jim Herd.
Yes.
And Jim Herd's complete wrestling background had been that he was once a station director at KPLR TV in St. Louis when Sam Muchnick did his wrestling program in the 60s. And that was back in the days when they didn't smarten up the TV crew, so he didn't even know whether wrestling was a work or not.
Oh, my God.
But he had been a Pizza Hut executive, but his wife was friends with the wife of the guy that worked for Turner Broadcasting that was in charge of the wrestling company, so they hired him to run it because of his wrestling background. And He's the guy who ran Ric Flair off. He's the guy who ran the Road Warriors off. He's the guy who he ran a lot of top talent off because of his bombastic management approach, his complete lack of understanding of anything about wrestling, and his just basic rudeness and disrespect to the way he treated the people involved. And we had quit one time before, and then we had been brought back when a new booking regime came in and overruled Hurd and outvoted him. He said, "All right, go ahead." And then when he handed us our contracts, the first words he said out of his mouth were, "You know, I was against this." And I said, "Yeah, we were too." And we stayed another year, and we were being disrespected, and we were just sick and fed up, and the company was losing money, and nobody was coming to the matches, and we were being beaten into powder, and we just decided that we'd rather be home than work for this fucking prick. And so it just came to a head one day when we had come off a several-day tour on the road, landed in Charlotte where we lived, and instead of being able to go home, immediately drove to Anderson, South Carolina to do a TV taping where they hadn't bothered to tell us that not only was Stan Lane only wrestling one single match, and I was only managing him in that, but that Bobby Eaton wasn't even wrestling at all. So instead of being able to spend a day with his family, he had to go to Anderson and sit with us because he was in the car with us. Then we went to Atlanta the next day to the TV taping and found out we were wrestling 4 matches in one night and going to get beaten all 4.
Jesus.
And we said, why couldn't we have done 2 of these matches the day beforehand where at least we could have split it up a little bit since it's all on tape anyway? And Ole Anderson, who I have made up with since then and I respect as a great talent in the business, said, "You know what, Cornette, if you don't like it, go home."
Jeez.
And I said, "You know what, Ole, that's the best idea that you've ever had. That's exactly where I'm going." And I walked out in the hallway to ask Stan Lane for the keys to his car so I could get my bags out and go rent a car and go home. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going fucking home." He said, "You know what? I'll go with you."
Oh, jeez. Wow.
And we had a quick meeting with Bobby because Bobby had 3 kids, which we did not, and he was making a 6-figure income as we were too, but he needed it more. And we said, "There's no hard feelings if you stay." And Stan and I got in the car and went home to Charlotte, and that was the end of that.
Wow. So Jim Hurd never attempted. He never tried to contact you to try to make it right.
Oh yeah, he sent me a letter which is actually reproduced in the Midnight Express book, saying that we understand that there was a misunderstanding between you and the booker, and that if you return and make your scheduled commitments, there will be no punitive action. And I called him back and said, "I ain't coming back to work for you ever again because I don't like you, and you've turned the business into a clown show, and you can either send me a release or I can do what I'm going to do anyway, and you can sue me." And they sent me a release, and that was the end of that.
Wow. That's I you know, like looking back at the, you know, the history of WCW, I rack my brain just like trying to figure out why a company like decided to take, you know, control of a professional wrestling promotion out of the hands of people actually in the industry.
And you know what? Once again, in the Midnight Express book, it's documented. We were drawing tremendous gates and crowds in the latter part of 1988. We sold out the Richmond Coliseum with 12,000 people. We were doing pretty decent business in most places, and within 6 months after Turner Broadcasting took over, we were running Greensboro, North Carolina in front of less than 1,000 people. And it just plummeted. The bottom fell out of business. And as a result, all the stars that were being highly paid, myself, the Midnight Express, the Road Warriors, Ric Flair, those guys, we were being highly paid because we had drawn the money, but through no fault of our own, suddenly, we weren't drawing any money, and so then they decided it was our fault and ran off all the stars. So,
yeah, no.
That may be a good place to leave Kayfabe Kickout for part 1 of this. My podcast is the Jim Cornette Experience every week on MLW Radio, and you can go to the website and get a link to that as well. And if you're in the United Kingdom, I'm coming in February. It's a corny in the UK, the Jim Cornette Experience Live. and so much more. Like I said, retirement is getting very busy for me, unfortunately. And thanks for having me on the program, and I encourage your listeners to keep listening because we need more Kayfabe Kickouts.
That's right, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for doing part one of this fantastic interview, Jim. And just like Jim said, you can check out his official website, jimcornette.com. You can check him out on MLW Radio, and just go to his site for all the latest Jim Cornette news. So that was part one, wrestling fans, of our fantastic interview with the legend Jim Cornette. And stay tuned for part two, which will drop in the new year once we get things ironed out to do a part two with Jim Cornette. And you can check out the official website of Kayfabe Kickout. That's kayfabekickout.com. We always have the latest wrestling news from the WWE, TNA, ROH, and more. We have a lot of fantastic free content, and I say free because I'm not going to charge you some bullshit premium monthly fee to browse the content of kayfabekickout.com. We have a ton of fantastic interviews. You're going to hear part one of this fantastic interview with Jim Cornette. We have lots of audio interviews with Christopher Daniels, Conan. We have print interviews with Jake the Snake Roberts, Scotty Briggs, and so much more. So that's kayfabekickout.com. You can check us out on Twitter, twitter.com/kayfabe_kickout. We're extremely active on social media. You can check us out on Facebook, the official Facebook page, facebook.com/kayfabekickout. You can check out our Google Plus page. Just go to the Google search bar and type in Kayfabe Kickout Google Plus. Check out our official YouTube channel if you're a big proponent of YouTube, where you'll find this interview with Jim Cornette. That's youtube.com/Kayfabe Kickout. Check out their official merchandise store. That's zazzle.com/Kayfabe Kickout. And that's going to do it for this fantastic edition of Kayfabe Kickout Audio for December 21st, 2013. Merry Christmas, everyone. I will be back with a brand new episode of Kayfabe Kickout Audio. So stay tuned, wrestling fans, and have a fantastic weekend.